On October 13, 1972, Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, chartered by an amateur rugby team from Uruguay, crashed in the Andes Mountains. 45 people were on board when the plane went down, but by the time they were rescued, more than 2 months later, only 16 were still alive. But the most horrifying thing about their story got to the surface after it was revealed that the survivors had resorted to cannibalism in order to survive. It was a Tuesday on October 12, 1972. Players of a rugby team from Montevideo, Uruguay, are on their way to fly for a rugby match in Chile. Other than the rugby players on board, on the plane were some of the team's family members, some of the team's supporters, and the 5 crewmates of the plane. They chartered a cheap Air Force plane because of the cost of flying commercial. They didn't know that they would have to fly on the Fairchild FH-227D, an American-made plane with a relatively weak engine for its weight. That's why it got the nickname Lead Sled. They would soon find out that this was a terrible mistake that would cost the life of 2/3 of the passengers on board. But for now, all they see is that it's the cheapest way to fly to Santiago over the Andes Mountains. Due to a terrible storm over the Andes, they had to stop in Mendoza, Argentina on their first part of the trip. They can't go straight from Argentina to Santiago because the plane can't fly the 25,000 feet to get over the mountains, so they decided to take another route around the mountains to skip the highest peaks. They set off again on Friday the 13th, which already sounds like a mistake for those superstitious, but they went anyway. The players have fun, throwing around the ball in the plane. Everyone is having a good time. Nobody has any idea what's coming for them. Sometime after the plane took off, the turbulence starts. But it's just some turbulence. Nobody takes it seriously. But then they look outside and in terror realize that the mountains are right outside the plane. They later found out that the pilots made a terrible mistake. Because of the dense clouds, the pilots couldn't see much, so they told air traffic controllers that they are just 1 minute away from the airport, when in fact they were 11 minutes away. They had no idea they were still in the mountains. Thinking the airport is just 1 minute away, the pilots decided to descend slowly so they can land the plane. Huge mistake. They were hit by more turbulence on the way down because of the strong winds that blow in the mountains. The plane was thrown around, and when they descended out of the clouds, they were met by a black side of the mountain right in front of them. They accelerated in an attempt to pull up, but with no luck. The plane collided with a ridge. The aircraft lost the back part of the fuselage and the other half flew forward. At this point, they were still at a high altitude, about 13,000 feet above the sea level. Then they went flying between 2 mountain ridges, which broke off both wings of the plane and thrown what's left of the aircraft in the mountainside. Somehow there are still survivors on the plane. After they stopped on a mountainside, something terrifying happened. The aircraft started sliding down the mountainside just like a snowboard. Luckily, they didn't hit any rocks on their way down. They were sliding for what felt like an eternity when they came to a stop at 11.7 thousand feet above the sea level. The people on the plane were in shock seeing the scene around. Some have died on impact, some had internal injuries that would most likely kill them, some were screaming in agony with their limbs twisted, but incredibly, a lot of them were still alive. But what's worse is yet still to come. The weather is harsh, it's freezing cold at this altitude, and the air is so thin it's hard to breathe. The survivors with minimal injuries are helping the others with more severe wounds. Most of them are badly hurt. Nando is in a coma and won't wake up for 3 days. Out of the 45 passengers, 12 died on impact. Some of them fell when the plane broke in half and are outside, covered in snow near the crash site. They knew the first night will be cold, but they never imagined it will be this cold, with temperatures dropping negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit or 30 degrees Celsius. They blocked all the entrances with everything they managed to gather: chairs, suitcases, or insulation from the plane. They are thinking this will be their first and last night on the mountain. They couldn't be more wrong. Because of the plane's white coloring, it camouflages perfectly with the snow outside and can be seen from the air by rescuers. On the first night, 5 more people died from their injuries. The next day, the ones in better condition tried to help the more unfortunate ones. Some are still screaming because their limbs are broken in multiple places. The pilot died on impact, but the co-pilot is still alive, trapped in debris. He has a handgun and begs them to shoot him in order to put an end to his suffering. None of them had enough courage to pull the trigger, so he died a slow, painful death soon after that. In an attempt to stay warm in such cold environment, the body burns a lot of calories, so they will need food in order to survive. They search the luggage trying to find something to eat. They don't find much. There are 8 chocolate bars, a tin of mussels, 3 jars of jam, a tin of almonds, some candy, a few bottles of wine, and a lot of cigarettes. For this many people, this is next to nothing. At least they don't have to worry about water, because they can melt the snow and drink the water. It's been 10 days since the accident and still nobody rescued them. A lot of the ones who survived died in these 10 days. The situation seemed hopeless and it's about to get worse. They heard on the radio that the search for them is called off. This destroyed the only hope they had. They were cold, hungry and alone in the snow jungle. At this point of extreme desperation, Nando, hungry and hopeless, told a friend, "I am going to eat the pilot." He wasn't the only one who had this idea. In fact, most of them had this thought in the back of their mind. One of them later told the media, "Our common goal was to survive, but what we lacked was food. We had run out of the meager pickings we'd found on the plane, and there was no vegetation or animal life to be found. After just a few days, we were feeling the sensation of our bodies consuming themselves just to remain alive." The survival instinct kicked in. They had no choice. They either eat or die. Only 27 people were left when they started to eat the pilots. They consumed everything, including the organs, in order not to waste any energy they could get. 17 days after the crash, something terrible happened again in the middle of the night. They've heard noises outside, something they've never heard before, and then snow started bursting through every hole of the plane. They immediately realized it was an avalanche. They were stuck in the plane for 3 days, in the dark and with limited air to breathe. They tried to dig to save the ones who were covered in snow, but to no avail. 8 more people died, but the rest somehow still survived. After 3 long days, the snow has melted and they again were out of the snow. Days went by and there was still no one looking for them. They had to continue eating the dead in order to stay alive. Some of them tried to go exploring the surrounding environment, but they were too weakened by the hunger and cold to walk more than a few hundred meters in the deep snow. Also, they were affected by sun blindness, the reflection of the sun in the snow, which basically burns your eyes. They improvised some snowshoes and sunglasses to protect them from the harsh environment, so they could explore a bit further. They eventually found the other half of the plane. Inside they found batteries, chocolate, candy and some comic books. They stayed the night in that second half they found, made a fire and they read the comics books all night. They tried to use the batteries found on the plane to repair the radio, but to no avail, as none of them got any knowledge on how to connect them. They were so depressed that they thought about just wandering around in the mountains until they would find someone, or that they would just die of exhaustion. From what they could remember, Chile was west, and they remembered that the pilot said they weren't far away, but they had no idea how far it was. It was actually 37 miles from the city, and it was no easy road. It was only mountains and rough terrain. On day 61, 3 men, Nando, Roberto Canessa and Antonio Vicentin, decided to go exploring until they would find someone to help them. They stacked up on human meat and went on their way. But before they left, Carlos Pez improvised a sleeping bag out of the insulation from the aircraft. They had no idea that thanks to this sleeping bag, they were able to survive the cold weather. In total, there were only 16 alive, all of them in a deplorable state. For 3 days, they climbed the first mountain. They were so disappointed when all they saw was more mountains and snow. Vicentin was so disappointed that he gave the food to Nando and Canessa and returned to the group. The remaining 2 didn't give up and continued the journey. They walked for what felt like an eternity. They almost didn't make it, but finally, they stumbled upon a river, and most importantly, on the other side, they saw somebody. They were overjoyed, but they couldn't cross the river, so they had to sleep one more night in the sleeping bag. The next day, the men came back with a pen and a paper and threw it over the river to our survivors. They wrote, "We are survivors of the plane crash. We have no more food, we cannot walk anymore, and there are more of us in the mountain. Where are we?" The man, in a hurry, went to get help, but it will still take a while as he was on horseback and still very far from civilization. It took 10 days for help to get to them. They were picked up by the army on horsebacks. They were skinny and suffered from malnutrition. After all this time, they went back for their friends in helicopters. The pilots couldn't believe they walked over the mountains in such conditions, without equipment and with such deplorable health. After many years, their journey was tracked and professionals found that their chance of survival was slim with the right equipment, let alone without it. Finally, it took them the days 73 and 74 to recover all the survivors. All of them eventually made a full recovery. Actually, to this day, only one of them is dead. The rest are well and very much alive. After the dust settled, many began asking questions. People began taking a closer look and realized there was no chance of surviving this without food. They admitted that they had to eat the dead, and the public turned on them, calling them cannibals and savages. They said eating other people was their last resort in order to survive. Nando said, "We tried to eat strips of leather torn from the pieces of luggage, though we knew that the chemicals would do us more harm than good. We ripped open seat cushions hoping to find straw, but found only inedible upholstery foam." Actually, some of the people who refused to eat human meat died of starvation shortly after. Eating human flesh wasn't easy, but ultimately it is the reason they made it down off the mountain alive and lived to tell the story. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, subscribe and share it with a loved one.